Thank you very much. And, well, I'm not standing again. Now, as you may realise from the CV, that tax is actually a small part of the work of the committee, but I'll try and give you a flavour of where I think things are at in Europe over a range of issues. So, during this last mandate of the European Parliament, fair payment of taxes has become a much bigger issue. There have always been concerns about tax havens, unfairness and the impact on developing countries, but the economic crisis and the realisation that it's not only developing countries that suffer has made it mainstream. A Parliament study, that's a European Parliament study, found that the EU lost up to 1 trillion a year due to tax evasion and avoidance. So in these times of repairing national balance sheets, everybody suddenly got very interested. Wanting to attract and collect employment taxes from multinational corporations, availing themselves of base erosion loopholes and turning a blind eye because of the jobs, is now more widely recognised as not helpful long term because of the unfair advantage those corporations then have over the competing local businesses, which not only paid employment taxes and provided jobs, but paid taxes on profits. So the net result was same jobs but less tax. This was concealed perhaps when looking at the high technology or major manufacturing companies that did not have immediately obvious local competitors, but it was plain for everyone to see in the coffee shop scenario. Thus, the political dynamic is now different. Although there are those that still take a more corporatist or short-term line, they are no longer in the majority. This is particularly noticeable on the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee, where we have been dealing with the debt problems of member states, where it is seen that the lack of a tax base in member states such as Greece has impacted, for example, on others through the dependency on the bailout regimes that have been put in place to support the euro. But although the economic crisis and the follow-on austerity put momentum behind ensuring fair payment of taxes, that does not necessarily make it any easier to legislate. Tax still requires unanimity in Council, so Parliament's role is that of being consulted. In our reports, we have enlarged the scope of the legislative proposals on automatic exchange of information in the Administrative Cooperation Directive, widened the general anti-abuse rules in the Parent Subsidiary Directive, and put more measures to avoid double non-taxation in the Interest and Royalties Directive. I think these proposals are generally good, though of course it's up to the Member States. Unlike the FTT, I'm afraid, which was strongly supported in the Parliament, although that majority is now dwindling, but it's well out of our hands now. Experience shows that it takes many years, and sometimes never, to reach unanimity in Council, which indicates the scale of difficulty in trying to get international measures. And there we also get into the inertia loop, with several EU countries saying it has to be done internationally. The truth is, there has sometimes the necessity for somebody significant to be brave enough to go first or find some other method of arm twisting. And generally speaking, in the Parliament, we think that the EU can be that someone. So in the Parliament, we have also adopted the tactic, and I admit to being a major proponent of this, of embedding what we can, where we can, in other co-decision legislation, in particular with regard to country-by-country reporting. For example, I got it into CRD4 for banks, although it's a two-phase process. You report first to the authorities and then you find out whether there are any problems and go public subsequently once you've worked out that there aren't really any problems after all. Again, in the Parliament, we reckon that transparency and public pressure is a good weapon, and you only have to look at the Amazon and Starbucks situations to see that. Under co-decision, Parliament has equal power with the Council, and the voting in Council is on a majority basis. But this is by no means an easy hurdle, but it is harder to block. Nevertheless, we have come up against blocking minorities in Council on some of these issues, even then, at least for those that are handled by the Legal Affairs Committee, where I tried, with limited success, to get some of the BEPS transparency issues covered in the Non-Financial Reporting Directive. And on this, I think it's worth noting that the divergence that we can see in the Parliament, where the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee is more progressive and the Legal Affairs Committee more corporatist, is reflected in the Council configurations as well. On the common consolidated corporate tax base, the Parliament considered that for large corporations it should be mandatory after a transitional period, in contrast to the Commission proposal, which made it optional. The Parliament further suggested that if unanimity could not be achieved, then it should progress under enhanced cooperation for the Eurozone. The latter proposal is more in line with the terms of the Fiscal Compact, which said that the common corporate tax base should be used. Now, I think you'll find some press comment from me at the time of that, drawing attention to the absence of the word consolidated in the Fiscal Compact wording. Journalists generally slid over that detail, but consolidation makes a big difference because the consolidation of profits and losses can give rise to some mutualisation of social benefits from one country to another. Losses caused by over-generous settlements are shared out. Of course, under EU law, this can happen anyway, as I think did with France, UK and Marks and Spencer. But in that instance, it's a last resort when there is no more tax to offset in the jurisdiction of the losses. There are also concerns that any common tax base would fire the starting pistol to allow the setting of a tax rate or minimum tax rate for which there is already an agreed precedent in VAT. Were it not for the fear of creep, a minimum rate for corporation tax has a lot to recommend it, and the Parliament has backed that notion in some reports. But on CCCTB, a Eurozone-based agreement looks the only possible, and I say possible rather than probable, result, even though that would mean strong-arm tactics against a couple of member states. More generally on tax base, I think it would be helpful to have easily available benchmark comparisons. In the EU, those countries that often boast their high corporate tax rates and criticise others actually have relatively narrow tax bases. Meanwhile, those that boast low rates to attract companies actually have wider bases. I don't know why we don't have a readily available benchmark notional company that gets run through the tax models of each country. After all, we do that with benchmark portfolios of assets run through bank models, so why not? My guess is that they do exist, and they just need to be more available and more widely deployed, as ultimately this is a matter where democracy will have an effect. This would certainly be helpful in the international context too. Another point is whether unfair or harmful tax competition, a highly ambiguous phrase at the best of times, is sometimes a distraction from paying attention to other competitiveness issues. There are dangers of that. Indeed, I would certainly say that historically that was the case, and I think with the sort of early move towards FTT, there were hints of that. But just as left and right have converged towards recognition of the tax avoidance problem, so too there has now been a forced convergence towards recognition that other competitiveness issues must be tackled. But as I have said, tax remains harder because it requires unanimity, and therefore if you park something behind a tax proposal, then you can use that as a delaying tactic, and I don't put that beyond some member states. Then there is the issue of what's unfair. I don't believe there's actually any convergence on that. Broadly, many on the left think that competing on tax rates at all is unfair, whereas the centre Liberals and the right accept that competition on tax rates is a way to constrain an overtaxing state and a drain on general competitiveness. The area of convergence of views is on tax avoidance and aggressive tax planning, and of course this is part of the space that is occupied by the OECD proposals on base erosion and profit shifting. And those OECD proposals have been presented to us in the committee. The Econ Committee is broadly supportive, and we have put them into our various recommendations. Now, those that have been cooler on the topic tend to be so because they want it done nationally or internationally rather than European-based. Now, my view is that the EU should sometimes be prepared to lead. Even the US Congress was bolder and first in Dodd-Frank and country-by-country reporting for extractives, without which I doubt the Europeans would have moved at all. Of course, it's a longer story and we go round the loop several more times on that yet. And of course, it might well be possible in due course to put BEPS principles into trade agreements. I think my time's probably up, so thank you very much.